Okay, it's time for a retro toy review. This is a toy from my collection, older toy. This is the original He-Man. Now, unfortunately, I don't have all of the accessories for this figure. I am missing the shield, and I'm missing the axe. And in fact, I'm not convinced that this is the original Power Sword. I think this might actually be a commemorative Power Sword. But honestly, I don't really care. To me, like, the differences are negligible. I don't even know what the differences honestly would be between a commemorative one and a vintage one, but it feels to me more like the commemorative plastic, which is why I suspect it might be that, since the plastics did feel slightly different in the hand. But, okay, speaking of putting it in the hand, we'll put it in his hand. So, there he has his Power Sword. So, this figure was pretty revolutionary at the time. Previously, action figures generally were like the Star Wars type of action figures. That was what was popular on the shelves at the time. And they were 3 3/4 inch, and they had 5 points of articulation, and they kind of stood at attention. And, since they were characters in a movie, they were, fairly skinny characters, but as you can see, he is not a skinny character. He was specifically posed to be in like an action type pose. A comic book type pose is how the designers described it. Mark Taylor described it as being a comic book type pose. Roger Sweet, who made the original He-Man prototype, took a big gym action figure and just piled a lot of clay onto it and made him really bulky and muscular. And in my opinion, He-Man has one of the best head sculpts of any action figure. Well, I got like a weird hair sticking out there. That's going to be distracting. Let me smooth that down a little bit. Hopefully that won't be too bad. Is it gone? Is it gone? It's gone. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. Technical difficulties. I need to trim my beard. Anyway, He-Man had, I think, one of the best head sculpts of any action figure. And as I'm watching this in my monitor, I'm seeing it in reverse. And it just looks weird when it's in reverse. Because, as you can see looking at it, his hair has kind of like this windswept sort of look, where it's all blowing in this direction. And seeing it backwards like that is just really disconcerting. So, this He-Man action figure is, at this point, probably about 40 years old. And I don't know exactly when it would have been produced. The copyright on the back, which doesn't really mean anything in this context, says 1981. But this He-Man was made in Mexico. So this is a Mexican He-Man. So what do they call it in Spanish? Los Amos del Universo, I think is what they call it. I was watching a video with the Spanish version of the opening credits of the TV show, and the Spanish version of the He-Man theme actually has a lot more lyrics, and I thought that was really awesome. I only wish I knew how to speak Spanish or could understand Spanish, so I could have enjoyed it even more. But maybe I can find like a translation of the lyrics or something like that. Anyway, there's this great expression on his face, which I feel like has a certain ambiguity to it, or if you look at it from certain angles, it looks like he's grimacing, but if you look at it from certain other angles, it looks like he's kind of smiling. And I like that element of it. Most action figures have sort of a neutral expression on their face, and for the most part, I like for my action figures to have a neutral expression on their face, but this is even better because you can kind of read certain emotions onto that face, depending on what you want the character to be feeling. Even though I usually like a more neutral expression, because when you're a kid playing with the action figures, you're projecting whatever you want onto that figure, and like an expression can be kind of distracting, but an expression like this can actually add more fuel to the imagination. So there are some unusual things about He-Man that I want to get into. One is that he has wristbands sculpted onto his wrists, but they were left unpainted, and this was an intentional decision. I presume that this was done to save money, because early on in the line, they didn't know whether it was going to be a hit or not, and didn't want to invest too much money into a line that might not go anywhere. So any place where they could cut corners, they did. But they sculpted on the wristbands and just didn't paint them. Now, the next year when they made Triclops, they actually did paint in his wristbands orange, but for whatever reason never went back and did that with He-Man once they had money. If I remember correctly, Thunder Punch He-Man had red wristbands to match his red armor, but I don't think any of the other He-Mans ever had painted wristbands. So also another thing that I think is unusual is this wristband is kind of a one that goes all the way around his wrist, and you can see it's got like several studs on it that look kind of like the studs on his belt. And this wristband over here is completely different because it's like more like a plate that's kind of on his arm, and it's got some studs on there but in a completely different pattern. And if you look at the back of it, there's nothing on the inside of his wrist, so I'm not sure how those are supposed to be held on. When I was a kid, I almost thought maybe like these little rivets on here were literal rivets that riveted the thing into the bones of his arm. That would be very uncomfortable. If we take a look real quick at the Masters of the Universe Classics version of the character, which I should have around here somewhere. There he is. The Masters of the Universe Classics He-Man added some straps to that wrist. He still has the same type of, bracer. It's clearly based on the original one, but they added some straps to the inside of the wrist so that now you can see how it actually is held onto his wrist. So, you can take off his sword and put it into the straps on his back, which I never really knew if it was intended to be designed that way, like if that was the intention of the designers, that you could store his sword back there. But it's what we all did as kids, anytime he didn't use his sword. Especially because, like, he can only hold his axe in this hand, and he can only hold his shield in this hand. Now, it's probably better if you have him hold the sword in his right hand, and then, this part can act as a hand guard, which I think was just something to help hold it in the action figure's hand and make sure it didn't get knocked out. I don't think it's literally supposed to be there. It's not in the original mini-comics, and it's not on the cartoon show. And you can also use that to make sure that he can hold his sword in this hand. You just kind of use that to hold it on there. I don't really like to do that because, as you can see, it kind of bends the hilt of the sword, and that's not very attractive. So I prefer to, if he's going to hold it at all, hold it in this hand. But if you wanted to have him dual wield, with both the sword and the axe, that's the only way to do it. So the chest armor does come off, and it's made of a soft, pliable plastic, so it easily does that. It attaches to the back with 2 buckles on each side, and a third buckle at the bottom, which these are more sort of like you feed the strap through the buckle, and this one's more like there's a little, almost like a button that fits into a notch on there, and it's got a slight lip to it, and that helps it hold on. And this armor isn't going to come off unless you want it to. So, unlike the Super 7 Filmation vintage style He-Man, where that one comes off if you look at it funny. I kind of fixed mine. I'll show you real quick. I kind of fixed mine by I took the armor, and what I did was I took it off of the figure, and I basically strapped up the straps on the back as tight as they would go, and had the whole thing wrapped together, sitting separately on my shelf overnight. And then when I put it back on, then it wanted to stay. But what would happen with mine is that since this plastic is so stiff, And this buckle here doesn't want to grip very well for whatever reason. Is this one will always kind of wind up popping off, and this one in the back would pop open. And you can see the middle strap on the Super 7 one is way too low. And it also didn't want to hold his sword because of that. But I think now that I've got it fixed, now it works pretty well. So yeah, as for the vintage scale, I have 3 different iterations of He-Man that are all supposed to be sort of the basic He-Man. And the Super 7 one is the weakest, mainly because of the problems with the harness, and the leg articulation was really stiff. And I'd heard a lot of people like breaking these, trying to move them, and I believe it because even though it didn't happen with my He-Man, it happened with my Skeletor. My Skeletor, first time I tried to move his leg, snapped right off. So I had a broken Super 7 Skeletor the day that I bought him. But what I'm going to wind up doing with that is, since like now there's the Origins figures, I'm going to take the head and the armor off of the Origins figure and put it onto the, or off of the Super 7 figure and put it onto an Origins Skeletor. Now I'll post, a video about that when I do it, but the Super 7 one is the weakest. It's still a nice action figure. It's got the same pullback. Oh yeah, I didn't even show that. Yeah, he's got like He-Man has a power action, which if you pull back on his fist, he will punch. And the Super 7 one also has that the original one has. And the Origins one does not, but the Origin one is also packed with all kinds of crazy articulation, which the modern action figure collector cannot live without. So, but this was enough action figure articulation for us back in the 80s. So I'm not going to complain. The one thing that the vintage He-Man is superior to every other version of He-Man ever made is that head, because it is a great head sculpt and very distinctive, and nothing has ever captured the magic of it. Even the Four Horsemen with the Classics line, and as brilliant as they are, and they're magicians, when they did their vintage version, this is a great head, don't get me wrong, but it still isn't better than the original one. The original one just has a certain magic that can't be captured. I mean, you look at them side by side, and you can see like this one even has a lot more paint detail, and the molding is a bit sharper, and they did the hair as a separate piece, so it gives it a little more of a three-dimensional quality, but it still doesn't quite capture the it's a great head. Don't get me wrong, I love that head sculpt, but this is hard to beat, man. It really is. Now, unfortunately, mine, since it's so old, like pretty much all the paint came off of this head, and I wound up repainting myself. This was about 20 years ago that I did this, though. I wound up repainting the eyes myself and the eyebrows, and I used black paint because that's what the original He-Man figure used. Yeah, he's got blonde hair and black eyebrows. Just deal with it. I think that I did repaint his hair, but most of that's chipped off too, so I guess I didn't use very good paint. So, so I'll probably be trying to repaint his hair again soon. And anyway, that's pretty much it as far as the vintage He-Man goes. This is still one of the greatest action figures of all time. This is one that was really influential in terms of where things were going to go. Not long after this, not long after Masters of the Universe with the action feature gimmicks, it became the standard. Like Superpowers, I think, took it even further. But, that pretty much became what 80s action figures had going for them, is they had different action features. And he's got like 5 points of articulation. And it's good articulation. Like there's things like, you can see the arm is at a slight angle here. So when he puts it up, it goes, even though it's kind of angled at the side, it goes straight up. And you can get some really good poses out of it, where like he's swinging a weapon. So, even just with 5 points of articulation, you can get some pretty interesting poses out of this figure. So, the articulation at the legs is kind of unusual because it's on this rubber band. And he can't really sit down like a normal figure. Like, that's about the best you can get him to actually sit down. But thankfully, most of the weapons and playsets were designed so that, like, you could sit He-Man in the throne of Castle Grayskull, like, pretty much like this. You might want to angle his legs a little bit. But he'll sit in it, and it looks perfectly natural, even with the leg articulation being the way it is. So, it works for what it is. It works a little less on the female figures, I think, but on the male figures, it works just fine. The fact that he's sculpted in that kind of squatted position helps. So, but anyway, yeah, He-Man is pretty much a perfect action figure. He was exactly what he needed to be, and it's no wonder that this line was able to capture the imagination of children all through the 80s. Anyway, I'm going to do one more of these real quick, so stay tuned for that one.